people's in attendance today. So just a FYI, we're hosting these exclusive webinars more frequently because we want the program to be more accessible to anyone within Australia. Housekeeping is that your camera and mics are turned off as you are the audience members, but please do feel free to ask questions. You can just put them in the chat that's located on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll be answering those throughout the presentation or keeping them for Patrick to answer at the end. And this webinar is being recorded, so anyone who did register will be receiving the recording in the next few days. So as I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A at the end. Patrick, I will just mention for all of our viewing experience, you can just select hide on that Microsoft Teams share screen at the bottom,
Yep.
and then I will let you kick off.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome everybody. As Caroline said, my name is Patrick Ferry and I'm the Assistant State Manager for Public Engagement here in Victoria, and I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon to share a presentation off the drawing board which highlights some of the real treasures we have in the Victoria office in the architectural space. Now, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, sea and community. I'm coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, and the traditional owners here are the Wurundjeri people, and I pay respects to their elders, culture and their people past and present. Before we get underway, many of you may be interested more generally in looking at researching a particular place. And there's a number of potential resources that you can go to find information about places in your local communities. So libraries, for example, are often repositories of published works, and they often have historical local history collections. Your local historical societies and the National Trust often have a range of databases and other resources that can assist you with the researching of a place. Trove is a wonderful source now of digitised newspaper material, which can have all sorts of information about places, as can some Victorian government agencies, so councils and also Land Victoria. What I'm going to be focusing in on today, though, are archives. Archives are repositories of official, original primary historical records. And as you'll see, the National Archives has a range of wonderful material about facilities and sites across communities. So just a bit of an overview of the National Archives itself. So we are the archives of the Australian or Commonwealth Government, and we operate under the provisions of the Archives Act 1983. And that empowers us to preserve as National Archives the most significant records created and generated by the federal government. We have 45 million items in our collection, in various formats, ranging, as you'll see, wonderful hand-drawn original architectural drawings through to photographic material, paper files, and increasingly digital material, which is being transferred in from federal government agencies. As a cultural institution of the federal government, we have offices in each state and territory capital city, which makes us very unique. Now, one of the things the Archives Act does is that it gives the public a right of access to Commonwealth records after 20 years. So we have a closed period for 20 years. And after that, you can apply for access to Commonwealth records. And we will give that access subject to some identified exemptions within our Act. Down here in Victoria, the National Archives is co-located with the Public Record Office of Victoria. We're located at the Victorian Archives Centre at 99 Shields Street in North Melbourne. We're open to the public Wednesdays through to Fridays from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And you need to make an advance booking to view records. The main reason you need to make an advance booking with us to view records is that most of our collection is actually held off-site, at a purpose-built repository at Burwood East in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And I'm coming to you from there today. And at that repository at East Burwood, we undertake a range of collection management operations, including storage of the collection, digitisation of material, and also its preservation. Before we get to look at some of the treasures in our collection down here, I just thought it would be useful just to explain briefly how the National Archival Collection is structured. So like any historical collection, be it a library or an archive, the National Archives collection has a structure which is provided by the Commonwealth Records Series system. And what this does is it recognises that we receive records that come from agencies. So an agency in this case could be the Department of Public Works, or Commonwealth persons, could be, for instance, a former Prime Minister. And they generate what's known as series of records. You'll hear me refer to series right out throughout the presentation. And series are records that document the same business functions and activities, that have similar formats and are related to each other through those formats and functions. And each series, be it a photographic series or a drawing series or a paper file series, will consist of individual items. So the item could be the individual drawing, it could be the individual photograph, or it could be the individual file. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. And when you hear me talking about series such and such, then you'll understand which level I'm talking about in our structure. So thinking about architectural records in the National Archives, we have a wealth of material that relates to buildings and sites connected with the Commonwealth Government. So we're looking at things like post offices, telephone exchanges, Commonwealth Bank buildings, drill halls, lighthouses, customs houses, airfields and airports, and defence facilities. Now, in some instances, the material we hold about these sites actually dates back to the 19th century. And this is because responsibility for some of these functions, such as post offices, transferred from the colonial governments to the federal government after Federation. So don't just think that because we're the archive of the federal government that we only hold material from 1901 onwards. Here in Victoria, as you'll see shortly, we have building drawings going back to at least 1850 for some sites. Here in Victoria, one of the main architectural record series that we have is a series called B3712, and these are folders of construction drawings. And these represent the main public works drawing series for Victoria from circa 1850 until 1975. Now, the earliest drawings in this particular series were prepared by the Victorian Colonial Architect and the Victorian Colonial Public Works Department. What you can see on the right there is a reproduction of that Victorian department's stamp, which you'll often see on these records as part of its provenance. Now, the series consists of tens of thousands of drawings, including elevations of buildings, schematics, floor plans, cross sections, engineering and mechanical layouts, and also on occasion details of original fittings. It's a real treasure trove of material about quite significant historical sites that existed in communities right across Victoria. And one of the reasons we're able to showcase material from that series to today is that we're undertaking at the moment a very large cataloguing project to describe the drawings in that series at the individual drawing level. And this is happening at our East Burwood repository. And if I was able to walk out into the repository area right now, I could show you that work being done as I speak. Now, when the project began a couple of years ago, there were around 5,000 items listed in this series on Record Search. Record Search is our online catalogue. Now we have just over 24,000 items listed in Record Search, and there are thousands more to be added through that project. And this project is being funded as part of the Australian government's $67.7 million Defend the Past, Protect the Future program. Now, what's very exciting about the project is that it's improving accessibility to these records to the public. And here we have a couple of photographs taken here at the repository where members of different historical societies have come in to view original records relating to their communities from B3712. And when they come in to view the originals, it just generates so much excitement. So this cataloguing project being done by our staff is really helping the local history community and others connect with these records. One of the things that has turned up as we've been going through the series are a number of hidden gems. Things which perhaps we weren't as conscious of in the collection because of the way they were described on the original item lists and things when the agency transferred these records into us some time ago. One of the most interesting gems that has come about as a result of the descriptive project are the original architectural drawings for the Portland Customs House in southwestern Victoria, and they actually date from 1849. I know the writing on the right will be a little bit unclear because it's written onto the back of, the material on the back of the drawings. But 1849 was pre-Victoria's separation from the state of New South Wales. And on the back, it's all about the contract, tender process to get this customs house built at Portland. And it's signed by Balmain, who the suburb in Sydney is named after. And that customs house is still there at Portland. So these are actually some of the earliest records relating to that building in that very early community in southwestern Victoria. Now, looking at the drawings a little bit more holistically, one of the amazing things about B3712 is it documents buildings from Melbourne right up to the Murray. So here we've got a couple of drawings from that collection. The one on the left is a cross-section of the Melbourne Customs House in Flinders Street. It's now the Immigration Museum. And that drawing is circa 1873. Very grand, important building on the sort of banks of the Yarra River in Melbourne. But also we've got on the right, the small customs office at Wagunya up on the Murray River from 1886, a much smaller building, but nonetheless very important in the day when there was actually a customs post at various sites along the border, which was of course the Murray River between New South Wales and Victoria. Now, many of the drawings in the series are hand-drawn masterpieces, particularly the early drawings. Everything was done by hand, the colouring, the shading, all done by hand, laboriously by architects and draftspeople. Sometimes the drawings are quite interesting. You can see here we've got on the right-hand side, the Ballarat Post Office. The one on the left is Castlemaine. And you can see with the Castlemaine drawing, the position of the clock tower, it's been rubbed out. The paper's been, they've rubbed out the clock tower and then positioned the drawing elsewhere on the page. In the folders of records relating to the Ballarat Post Office, this is one of my favourites, and I call this one Oops, because you can see that the contents of somebody's inkwell has been spilt across the face of the drawing. One wonders what happened to the poor clerk or draftsperson that ruined the masterpiece. But it's interesting that the drawing was retained as it was, despite the fact it's got this massive ink stain right across it. And I think that actually is a reflection of how much time and effort went into these drawings. You know, there would be hours and hours and hours of laborious work going into these drawings. And even though this particular drawing was ruined by the ink blot, you know, you're not going to redo the drawing again necessarily because of the investment of time and effort that went into producing them. Now, one of the interesting aspects of these drawings is that for any particular site, they can provide quite an interesting window into the building's history. And what I'm going to do here is showcase some drawings related to the Melbourne General Post Office. So the grand building on the corner of Burke and Elizabeth Street in Melbourne, one of the Commonwealth Government's premier um, properties in Melbourne. And what we have here is a drawing from the 1880s showing the third floor of the GPO. It was actually built over a few decades in stages, and the final stage was in the 1880s when the third floor went on. Here we have some original engineering drawings, though, from the 1850s build. And what they show are engineering details of the colonnades that are on the ground floor of the town hall, of the General Post Office. Here we also have original 1850s floor plans of the layout of the post office in the day. Now, many of you would realise that the GPO building now is a department store. So, you know, what might have been a mail room could well be, you know, the menswear department in H&V now. As I said, additions were put on in the 1880s, and here we have some architectural drawings of that third floor that was added to the building then. And here we've got some further rich detail from those 1880s additions. And you can see again the detail that's gone into these drawings. You know, you've got the details of the rosettes, the stone carving, the door frames, this sort of thing. Now, you might note also on this drawing that there is a little bit of colour. And you can see various colours there, particularly pink. We've got a display of a number of architectural drawings in the research centre at North Melbourne at the moment. And when we opened that display, an elderly gentleman came in to look at the drawings, and he was taking a great interest in them. And I struck up a conversation with him, and it transpires that he was a retired architect, and he was saying that the colour schemes in these drawings reflect quite long established conventions in the architectural field. And the colours indicate different materials that were to be used in the construction. So that pinkish colour that you can see there is actually representative of brick. And so, like many of these grand buildings, they've often got a stone facing, and then behind the stone facade, you'll have brick and timber and other materials obviously supporting the structure. What's really interesting about the GPO designs is that the drawings go down to lots of the fittings and some of the lesser known parts of the building. So for instance, here we have details of the belfry and how the bells were to be originally hung in some of the bell towers. Here we've got a very beautiful detail of the clock face for the clock in the tower. Here we have the details of the letter lift that ran from the basement up to the ground floor, and that was circa 1910. Here we've even got detailed designs for the joinery for the writing slopes that were in the public hall of the GPO. And you can see this would guide, the carpenters in putting together that exquisite joinery. Here we're progressing into the 1930s. We've got details of new post boxes that were being erected on the facade of the post office itself. And the detail here, is even down to, what each post office box would be for and which destinations those letters would be heading for, so that they knew where to put each of the post boxes. So incredibly rich detail from a heritage and history perspective into that particular landmark building in Melbourne. Now, the charm is in the detail. Many of these older drawings, in particular from the 19th century, they have what are called these elevation drawings. And so here we have on the left-hand side, the front elevation for the Post and Telegraph Office in Geelong, a local landmark in that regional centre. Now, one of the interesting things about these elevations is these obviously have the most effort that's gone into them, but these were produced in part to be attached to the contract. And what you can see down the bottom there, you have a bit of a stamp, and often what you'll have is a stamp signing off by the architect, but also the builder who took on the work would often sign off these original drawings. On the left, we've got the contract front elevation. On the right, we've got actually a cross section of that tower, where you can see on the left-hand side of that drawing, the finished surface on the outside, and then the skeletal, structure inside. These are the contract drawings for the Collingwood Post Office in Smith Street, which was erected in the early 1890s. What's interesting about this particular building is that there was a post office there from, I believe, as early as the 1860s, and then in the 1890s, this grand facade was added to the front of the building, and it was designed in an Italianate style, which was one of the predominant styles that was coming out of the Victorian Public Works department at the time. And I believe the erection of this facade helped cement Smith Street as what the premier commercial street of Collingwood. Again, on the left-hand side, you can see various colours represented in the drawing. You can again see where the brickwork was going beneath the facade. There's a sort of strawy light brown colour for timber. In this case, the grey colour is actually metal, a sort of pressed metal for the clock tower there. We have a look on the right-hand side, though. You can again see the degree of detail that has gone into these drawings. You can even see how the draftspeople have even created the sense of reflections in the windows in the way that they have tinted the glass. And again, the architect that I was talking to some months ago was saying that these drawings went through a number of what was called washes. So they're hand coloured with watercolour, and then to get the different degree of detail, you'd go over and over and over again to produce the effect that you needed for the drawings. This is the drawing for the Post and Telegraph Office in Carlton in Elgin Street, which I believe was a working post office until fairly recently. Again, a slightly Italianate design. What we've got here, though, is a smaller elevation, and then you've got your cross sections both front and rear. And what's interesting on the left-hand side is you've got the original floor plan for this double-story building. And the floor plan itself is actually quite interesting. It's quite revealing in some respects as to what the social status of a postmaster must have been at the time. So on the left-hand side, we've got the ground floor, which is the public space of the post office in the front. You've got a telegraph room and a telegraph lobby. On the left-hand side, you've got the mail sorting room on the right-hand side. And then you've got various rooms at the back, including a kitchen and a dining room that obviously staff would use during the day, but also the postmaster and their family in the evening. But what you've got upstairs is you've got the original layout of what was effectively the apartment above the post office. And you've got bedrooms there, sitting rooms, a bathroom, but also if you have a look very closely in the top right, back right-hand corner, you've got a servant's bedroom. So again, I think that's a little bit of a clue as to the social standing that a postmaster may have held in the 19th century. This on the left-hand side is the contract drawing for the Elstonwick post office in Glen Huntly Road. It's still standing, although it's not a post office now. This was also built in the early 1890s, and it was just in what was described as a Queen Anne or style. So red brick in that sort of Tudor type style, faced with various bits of stonework and also a clock for the public. What we see on the right-hand side is the side elevation of that building and the cutaway into the structure of the building, the internal structures. And again, you can see the use of those same colours, particularly in this one, a lot of that sort of pinkish colour standing for the red brick. Also in that Queen Anne style, the what was called the new public offices at Kew. So again, from the Victorian colonial government, but then transferring part of the site to the federal government after federation. So in this case, at Kew, the complex included a post office, but also a courthouse and some other state government offices. Here again, we've got another example of this sort of Queen Anne style. This is the Footscray Post and Telegraph Office. I believe this no longer exists. What's interesting about this is that what you can see when you look at various post offices is that in some respects they had almost like a particular style or model for a post office, and you'll see features in individual post offices repeated across suburbs. In this case, you can see there's a colonnade of arches on the ground floor. My local post office in Berwick, it's only a one-story building, but it's got the exact same arcade of arches there that appears in the double-storied Footscray post office. So there was a bit of mix and matching with some of the designs to suit the sites and the need in particular localities. One of my favourite buildings documented in the series is actually the Flemington Post Office. Now, this is still a working post office not far from our office in North Melbourne. What I think is again a red brick building, but here slightly different flourish. You've got this wonderful onion dome on top of the tower, which gives it a sort of eastern feel to the building. Now, what's also very interesting about the Flemington site is how they adjusted the design to actually reflect what they had in terms of a site. So the Flemington post office is built on a triangular block. And you can see that particularly from the aerial roof shot drawing in the center there, how the building has actually, you've got the tower right at the apex of the triangular block, and the building actually basically occupies more or less the whole of the triangular site. So again, adjusting designs to suit the site that was available to them. Now, some of what we've been looking at are some of the more magnificent post offices that were built around Melbourne, particularly in the late 19th century. The series, though, B3712, goes from the magnificent to the much more modest. So here we have a 1920s drawing for a new post office in the beachside suburb, or bayside suburb, sorry, of Elwood. And again, this is a design that you would see repeated in various suburbs. The post office down at Pakenham East, for example, was very similar in design to this more modest Elwood post office. And the mundane is actually also documented in the series. Here, what I've got are line drawings from the 1920s for two bicycle sheds that were to be built respectively on the left at the Cheltenham Post Office and on the right at the Caulfield Post Office. Now, bicycle sheds played a really important role in the post offices in this era because that's how the telegrams were delivered. You know, each post office would have a number of bicycles so that the telegrams could be delivered to the door of the recipient. Here we've got also from the series details of the ladies' conveniences that were installed in the Hawthorn telephone exchange in the 1920s. So even down to details of the plumbing, and you can see there at the top left-hand corner, you can see the toilet bowl and the cisterns up on the wall, and there's that long chain that I know some of us will be familiar with. I grew up in a house that had its facilities very similar to that. One of the other interesting aspects of this particular series is it also details the ghosts of buildings past. So buildings that once graced our streetscapes, which no longer exist. So what I've got here for you is a 19th century drawing of an orderly room. Now, an orderly room was where officers of the Victorian colonial militia would attend. And it was on the corner of William and Beckett Street. So it was very close to what's now Flagstaff Gardens and the Flagstaff railway station. And this orderly building was on that site because this was where militia units would train. It was a very modest timber building. Here again, looking at those colour schemes, you can see the chimney is in a slightly pinkish colour because it was brick. And again, you can see that sort of greyish metallic colour on the roof. Well, here it's the corrugated iron for the roof. Now, this building was demolished in the 1930s to build a much more substantial drill hall for the Australian Army Medical Corps. And some of you may be familiar with this building because this building is now the home of the Royal Historical Society of Victoria. So we have the early 19th century drawings for the early defence buildings on the site, and then also the 1930s Art Deco inspired replacement building. Another building that sadly disappeared from our landscapes. This was the beautiful Post and Telegraph office at Camberwell in Melbourne's inner east. You look at the detail of that, and this was demolished in the 1960s to make way for a very nondescript replacement, I'm afraid. The series also contains a number of unrealised visions, architectural visions, and I'm going to demonstrate this by looking at some drawings in our collection of the State Parliament House building in Melbourne. And we do have some of these drawings on display at the moment in the research centre at the Victorian Archive Centre. And people sometimes ask, well, why do you have the state government's buildings if you're the National Archive? But this was the first federal parliament's building after the first meeting was actually in the exhibition building. But after that, the federal parliament sat in the state parliament buildings from 1901 until the old Parliament House in Canberra was opened in 1927. So we have a range of drawings about the state parliament house and how it was used by the federal government during that time. And part of what we've got in the collection are drawings of the unrealised dome for Parliament House. There's a reason we've got these, which I'll explain in a moment. But in our collection, we have copies of 19th century drawings by Peter Kerr, who was the original architect who worked on the State Parliament House, and of the very majestic dome, which would have been several stories high, that he had wanted built on the building. Now, this wasn't built in the 19th century. The plans were there, and then the Great Depression of the 1890s hit, and obviously the money was not there to build the Grand Dome. But what we can see here are very, very detailed drawings of what that dome would have looked like. And here again, you've got cross sections and elevations and overviews of that Peter Kerr designed dome. Now, interestingly, when the federal parliament was about to vacate the building around 1925, 1926, they began thinking about, well, what can we do to thank the Victorian State Parliament for basically giving this building rent-free to the federal parliament for basically a quarter of a century. And one of the proposals that was made was that the federal government would actually fund the building of a dome for the building. There was £50,000 that the Parliament was prepared to vote to build a lasting memorial to the Commonwealth's connection with the building. Now, £50,000 in the 1920s was an awful lot of money, but it was not actually going to realise Peter Kerr's original vision for the building. So the Commonwealth architect and his Victorian counterpart got together and they tried to come up with a proposed dome that would fit within the envelope available to the federal parliament. And this is what they came up with. This is a small conceptual sketch that exists on a Department of Works file related to Parliament House. Now, in B3712, we've actually got quite detailed architectural drawings for that dome. And if you have a look at the drawing on the left, you can see one way they were going to try and fit the cost of this dome into the available budget. That was principally by using a brick construction. The brick construction is indicated by the pink, as we've said before, merely faced with stone. But they were also going to construct the actual dome out of concrete. And the concrete is illustrated by that slightly greeny colour that's on the inside of the dome. And you can see little dots, which stands for the sort of concrete particles. So they're trying to use cost-effective materials to keep the cost of the dome within the allocated budget. Now, interestingly enough, if I go back to the conceptual sketch, when this was put to the Victorian Parliament, they were just aghast at this particular dome. It was criticised as being too squat for the building, so it was going to be nowhere near as high as the Peter Kerr design. The dome is actually much flatter, so it was unflatteringly compared to the dome on top of Spencer Street Station. And the feeling by the Victorian parliamentarians was this was not going to realise the original vision of the building. So they basically declined the dome. In the end, the federal parliament simply voted £50,000 to be spent by the Victorian parliament on some form of building works that would appropriately commemorate the federal government's presence in the building, that historic first quarter of a century of the federal parliament. And in the end, amongst the things that the £50,000 was spent on was the construction of new dining rooms and tea rooms for members of the state parliament. So an interesting use of that money in the end. Now, most of the drawings that I've been showing you thus far obviously relate to B3712. However, we've got a number of other architectural drawing series held here in Victoria, and a couple of them which are on the slide there, MP338/1 and MP427/1. These relate to defence sites that were built by the colonial Victorian government. And MP338/1 in particular relates to the fortresses that were built to defend Port Phillip Bay in the late 1800s. And the drawing we've got there on the right-hand side is actually of one of those fortifications, the South Channel Fort, which is still there. It's part of the National Park now. We also have in our Canberra office a series of drawings, A9568, which relates to lighthouses, and some of those date back to the 1830s, and I'll show you some examples of those in a moment. So just taking some of those defence drawings, again, these are works of art, a lot more obviously very technical, showing you things like the battery emplacements and things, in this case at Fort Queenscliff. What I think is very interesting is you've got the elevations in the upper right-hand corner, which show how these fortifications were sort of burrowed into the landscape. And then at the bottom, you've got a bit more of an aerial cross-section of what was under the ground. Here we've got another battery location, including in the centre there, where one of the big gun emplacements would have been, installed there at Fort Queenscliff. Now, Fort Queenscliff, for those of you who are not aware, is just outside of Geelong. And it guards the heads to Port Phillip Bay. And there were corresponding defences on the Mornington Peninsula side. And these were some of the most impressive coastal defences in the British Empire. In actual fact, Melbourne became known as the sort of Gibraltar of the South in some respects because of the strength of these defences. Here again, we've got cross sections of some of the Queenscliff batteries. Showing how these were built into the landscape. Here, the green is obviously for the grass that's growing, on top. And what's interesting about the drawing here is on the left-hand side, you've got sort of an aerial view. So you've got all the grass at the top, and then you've got the cliff faces there, hatched in sort of a grey colour. Of course, not just the massive batteries and fortifications at that site. Here I've got two lovely little drawings. On the left, we've got a proposed grocery store at Queenscliff, built in timber. And then on the right-hand side, we've got details of the butcher's shop for the garrison. So even down to some of those more mundane facilities that may not actually have survived over time. This is a schematic of the defences on the Point Nepean side of the bay. And again, you can see the locations of the various batteries and their proximity to things like the shoreline and the bay itself. And that dates from 18 95. In terms of those lighthouse drawings I referred to, here are some very early drawings from the 1840s, which show a cross-section of where the lighthouse was to be placed at Gaybo Island off East Gippsland. So again, 1840s is this Gippsland was still part of New South Wales at that point. Here we've got the original light that was proposed for Gaybo Island. Very modest structure, timber structure, which went up a bit of a ladder to get to, and then you've got the room for the light up the top. And here we've got a cross section of the much more substantial stone and brick lighthouse that was built to replace that earlier one. And I love this drawing, even though it's been damaged over time, because the left-hand side there, you see the spiraling staircase coming down the inner part of the column for the lighthouse. So in addition to the actual drawings, there's often what's called a property file that sits behind the acquisition and management of those sites. Now, there are multiple series of these records because multiple agencies were involved in the management and acquisition of these properties over time. So for a defence site, you may find there's a file from the Department of Defence about the site, but there may also be a Crown Law Office file that relates to, for example, the acquisition of the sites. And there may be files from the Chief Property Officer of the Commonwealth in Victoria as well. So there are multiple series of those records depending on the time period and the agencies involved with the sites. Just to give you a bit of an idea though, that what you can find on those files, remember the proposed dome for the Parliament House back in 1926. Well, there is a Director of Works file on that project. And here what we've got is a detailed cost estimate of what the dome would cost. And it was going to come in at £41,000. And even down to detailed estimates for carving Corinthian columns to put on the facade of the column that was holding up the dome. One particular type of facility that we have quite a lot of rich information about in Victoria are post offices, local post offices. So there's a number of series that you can use here in addition to the drawings. So we have post office history files in B5846, and they contain wonderful information about the operations of post offices over time. We've also got photograph series, particularly B5919, which is a master set of historical photographs of post offices, in some cases actually going back beyond 1901. Now, the number of photographs for any one particular post office will vary dramatically. Some post offices, there might only be a single photo, but others, as I'll show you shortly, have a lot more richer detail. We have post office guides, which detail the services that were provided by the post offices. And we also have the Postmaster General's files. And these were often the files they raised when they were opening post offices or building new post offices and things like that. So just look at the post office photographs for a minute. I'm going to use the example of Berwick. Remember I mentioned earlier that it had a very similar ground floor colonnade to the one that appeared in that drawing of the double-storied Footscray post office. Interestingly, with the Berwick post office, the post office was on the left and the local magistrate's courthouse or police court was on the right-hand side. Here we've got a view of the rear of the building. Now this building is preserved, so This rear shot here, which shows what was the postmaster's residence. Postmaster's residence is still there. But this shot, which was probably taken in the early 70s, judging by the Mercedes with the Americana headlights, shows an extension that was built on the corner. Now that's no longer there. That has since been demolished. It didn't have any heritage value. Interestingly here, we've got the bicycle shed. I mentioned the bicycle sheds before, and you can just see when this photograph was taken, maybe in the 60s, there's still a bicycle lurking in the shed there. And there's actually some interesting interior shots of this post office, principally judging by the sideburns and the dresses, probably from the 1970s, which gives you a bit of a sense of what that post office was like during that period. For other post offices, though, I've seen much earlier photographs of the interiors and the operations. All right, look, I hope you found that little bit of a journey through some of these amazing architectural drawings interesting. What I want to do now is just spend a few moments showing you how you can locate some of these records. And the starting point to locate them is our website, which is www.naa.gov.au. And on our homepage there, we've got a tab there, a button, blue button for record search. And record search is our online collection database or catalog. So if we go into record search, you can do searches on a number of different levels. You can do a basic search like the one I'm about to illustrate. And the basic search basically searches for keywords that appear in the titles of items. So the item could be a file, it could be a drawing, or in this case could also be a photograph. And in the basic search, we're looking at keywords and we can put some dates in. But if I just do this search for the Ballarat drill hall, for example, what I get are 19 matches in our database. And we can see from that list, there's a number of different series represented. So the first one is from a series called A457. And you can see there's a bit of metadata there. So it's open, which means you can view the entire file, but it's located in Canberra. And that's one of the things that it is important to note, that as a national archives, our collection is distributed across the country. And so you will find records relating to Victorian places may be held in Canberra as well as Melbourne. Now, we don't actually transfer records between our sites because what we're dealing with here are original records, and the risks, obviously, of transferring material are too great from both a loss perspective, but also from a preservation perspective. So if you wanted to view that file, you'd have to view it in Canberra, or you can actually, through our website, request to have it digitized, but there are charges that apply to digitization. The other items, though, in the series, in the list, are all held in Melbourne, and they're open, so you could request to view those either via our North Melbourne Research Centre, or again, you could request to have them digitised. And if you wanted to understand what each of those items related to, all you have to do is click into the item, and then there are some hyperlinks that will take you to what that particular series involves. You can also do a more advanced search. This allows you at the item level to actually choose a number of other variables. So for instance, you could choose just to look at maps and plans by choosing cartographical records in the in the drop-down list under physical format. You could say, I'm only interested in items in Melbourne. You can also, at the bottom of that advanced search screen, also say, I'm only interested to look at items that are already digitized. Taking you back to our home page, one of the things to remember about record search is that whilst we have 45 million items in our collection, Uh, Only about 40% of the collection is listed in record search. So if you do keyword searches in record search and you're not locating what you hope to find, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. What it may mean is that it just hasn't been catalogued or indexed yet, and we have access to other lists and records that can help us locate that material for you. So what you do in that instance, go back to the website, choose the Help with Your Research tab, and click on Ask Us About the Collection, and you can submit a reference inquiry to us. And that will come to us, and we'll spend a little bit of time looking at your reference inquiry, looking through the collection to see what we can find, and we'll give you what we turn up, or we will find other leads for you to follow up. Just a little bit of a plug in our research centre at the moment. We have a lovely display. It's a joint display with the Public Record Office of Victoria, looking at the architectural records within our collection and connecting our two collections around a number of sites around Melbourne. So if you do have time at some point, please do come and visit the Victorian Archives Centre and just ask to go through to the research centre to see our connecting collections display. This display was put together for Melbourne Open House last year, and it will be up until June this year. Look, that's the end of the presentation, and